Hi, and welcome to the archive of history. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing in a place where wealth was measured not in coins, but in the weight of raw gold held in your palm. Picture a world where the glint of precious metal came not from a mint, but from the bed of a sacred river. You are about to journey to a kingdom that existed on the threshold of one of humanity's greatest inventions, a place where the very concept of money as we know it had not yet been born. This is the story of Lydia, a realm of almost mythical richness, a land where kings controlled the gold of rivers and merchants traded without ever seeing a single coin. Tonight we travel back more than 26 centuries to a time when the modern world was taking its first uncertain steps, and we will walk through the streets of a civilization that stood at the precipice of economic revolution. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. The year is somewhere around 650 BCE. The place is Western Anatolia, the peninsula we now call Turkey. But in this distant age it is a patchwork of kingdoms and city-states, each with its own character, its own gods, its own way of understanding the world. Here in the river valleys beneath mountains that touch low-hanging clouds, lies a kingdom that will one day change the course of human civilization. But in this moment, before that change, Lydia is a land governed by older rhythms, by the ancient pulse of barter and exchange, by the trusted weight of uncoined metal, and by the sacred authority of kings who claimed descent from heroes and gods. You are about to experience what life was like in this threshold kingdom, to feel the texture of existence before the invention that would revolutionize trade, before the first standardized coin was stamped from precious metal. You will walk through markets where goods are weighed against lumps of electrum, that mysterious natural alloy of gold and silver that flows from the earth itself. You will stand in the shadow of mud-brick palaces, breathe the incense of temples where oracles speak, and listen to the hammerfall of craftsmen who work metal with ancient skill. This is not a story of battles alone, though there will be war. It is not merely a chronicle of kings, though kings will walk through these words. This is a story of daily life, of ordinary wonder, of a people who lived in a world both familiar and impossibly strange. It is the story of what was lost when efficiency replaced ritual, when the standardized disc of metal replaced the negotiated exchange, when the abstraction we call money began its long conquest of human relations. Tonight, as you settle into comfort and let the concerns of your own time fade into shadow, we will travel together to that older world. We will see through the eyes of those who knew nothing of what was coming, who lived their entire lives in an economic system that to us seems unimaginably cumbersome, yet to them was simply the way things had always been. Let the modern world recede, let yourself drift back through the centuries. Let us begin our journey into the kingdom of Lydia before the first coins of gold. Now settle in. Let your breathing slow. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let us travel back to a time of river gold, of sacred kings, of merchants who kept their wealth in leather bags, and of a civilization standing unknowingly at the edge of profound transformation. The story begins not with the invention itself, but with the world that existed before it, a world we must understand if we are to grasp what was truly revolutionary about that simple stamped disc of metal that would bear the roaring image of a lion. The land and its people. Imagine waking to the sound of roosters in the grey hour before dawn. You are lying on a sleeping mat woven from reeds, covered with a woolen blanket, dyed a deep red color that is famous throughout the known world. The air is cool and carries the scent of wood smoke from a hearth fire that has burned low through the night. You rise slowly, joints stiff from sleep, and step out into the early morning. The landscape that surrounds you is neither desert nor lush forest, but something in between, a land of rolling hills covered with low scrub oak and pine, of valleys where rivers run clear over beds of smooth stone, of mountains in the distance whose peaks catch the first light of the sun, while the valleys remain in shadow. This is Lydia, and you are one of its people. Your village sits in a river valley, a collection of perhaps 40 houses built from mud brick and timber, their roofs thatched with reeds cut from the riverbanks. The houses cluster together for protection and community, separated by narrow lanes that turn to mud when the winter rains come. Beyond the village lie the fields, carefully tended plots where barley and wheat grow in the rich alluvial soil. Beyond the fields, the hillsides rise, covered with olive groves and vineyards, and beyond these the wild lands begin, where shepherds take their flocks and where wolves and bears still roam. The river Pactolus flows perhaps half a mile from your village, its waters running swift and cold from the heights of Mount Tumulus. This river is sacred. This river is the source of wealth that makes your kingdom famous across the known world. Its waters carry gold, fine grains of precious metal that have washed down from the mountains, and in places along its course men work waist-deep in the current, panning and sluicing, separating the heavy gold from sand and stone. But more of this sacred river later. For now, in this early hour, it is simply a presence in the landscape, a silver thread in the valley below, its distant sound a constant whisper beneath all other sounds. The people of Lydia speak a language that is their own, related to the tongues spoken by their neighbors but distinct, a language that will one day disappear almost without trace, remembered only in a few inscriptions and in words that survive in Greek texts. They are not Greeks, though Greek cities dot the coast, perhaps 50 miles to the west. They are not Phrygians, though Phrygia lies to the east, and there is much commerce and occasional conflict between the two peoples. They are Lydians, and they have inhabited these valleys for so many generations that no one can remember a time when they were not here. Their legends tell of heroes and gods, of kings who were descended from Heracles himself, of ancient compacts and sacred obligations that bind the present to a past that fades into myth. You are a farmer, one of many, neither wealthy nor destitute, occupying that broad middle station that has always formed the foundation of any settled society. Your father was a farmer before you, and his father before him, back through generations uncounted. Your work is dictated by the seasons. In spring you prepare the fields, breaking the soil with a wooden plow pulled by oxen, scattering seed by hand, praying to the gods for rain in its proper measure. In summer you tend the growing crops, watch the sky for signs of storm or drought, repair the stone walls that border your fields. In autumn you harvest, working from first light until darkness makes it impossible to continue, cutting the grain with a bronze sickle, binding it into sheaves, threshing it on flat stones while your children chase away the birds. In winter, when the work in the fields is done, you repair your tools, weave new baskets, maintain your house, and prepare for the spring that will inevitably come. Your world is small in terms of physical space. Most people in your village will live their entire lives within a day's walk of the place where they were born. The capital city, Sardis, lies perhaps 3 days' journey to the north, and you have been there twice in your life, once as a young man when you went with your father to trade surplus grain, and once to witness a great festival in honor of the king. For most people, the village is the world, and the world beyond is known only through travelers' tales, through the occasional merchant caravan that passes on the road, through stories told on winter nights of distant lands and strange peoples. Yet despite this physical isolation, your life is not simple or provincial in spirit. The Lydians are proud people, conscious of their place among nations. They know that their kingdom is wealthy, that their king is powerful, that the gold of their rivers is desired from Egypt to Babylon. They know that Greek philosophers and poets sometimes come to Lydia, drawn by tales of wisdom and wealth. They know that their textiles and metalwork are prized throughout the known world. This knowledge gives a certain confidence to even the humblest farmer, a sense that to be Lydian is to be part of something significant, something that matters beyond the boundaries of one's own valley. The social structure of Lydia is, like most ancient societies, hierarchical and seemingly fixed by custom and tradition. At the apex stands the king, who rules from his palace in Sardis, who commands armies, who dispenses justice, who mediates between the people and the gods. Below him are the nobles, men who own vast estates, who serve as the king's advisors and generals, who live in fine houses with many servants. Below them are the merchants and skilled craftsmen, people who possess specific knowledge, who work in metal or dye, or who know the roots of trade. Below them are the farmers like yourself, and below you are the landless laborers who work for wages, and at the bottom are the slaves, prisoners of war, or those sold into bondage by debt or misfortune. Yet this hierarchy, while real, is not absolute in its rigidity. A skilled craftsman can become wealthy. A farmer who has good fortune with his harvests can accumulate land and rise in status. A merchant can become indispensable to the king and be elevated to the ranks of the nobility. The society is old enough to have established patterns, but not so ossified that movement between stations is impossible. This fluidity, This sense that merit and fortune can change one's place is part of what gives Lydian society its particular character, its dynamism and energy. As the sun rises higher and the morning chill begins to lift, you prepare for the day's work. You break your fast with barley bread, perhaps some cheese made from sheep's milk, a handful of olives. You drink water drawn from the village well, cold and clean. Your wife is already at work, grinding grain for tomorrow's bread, a task that consumes hours of labor every day. Your children, if they are old enough, will spend the day helping in the fields or tending the small flock of sheep and goats that provide milk and wool, and occasionally meat for festival days. Your elderly mother sits in the doorway, spinning wool on a simple drop spindle, her fingers moving with the automatic precision of decades of practice. The rhythm of your life is dictated not by clocks which do not exist, but by the sun, by the seasons, by the demands of crops and animals, by the cycle of festivals that mark the passage of the year. It is a life that would seem impossibly laborious to someone from a later age, yet it is the only life you know, and within its constraints there is satisfaction, even moments of deep contentment. There is the pleasure of seeing grain sprout in a field you have prepared. There is the communal joy of harvest, when neighbors help each other and celebrate together. There is the quiet pride of providing for your family, of maintaining the farm that your ancestors maintained before you, of participating in the great continuity of human life lived close to the earth. And always in the background of consciousness, there is the awareness that you live in a kingdom that is itself alive with activity and change, that somewhere in Sardis kings are making decisions that might affect your life, that on the roads merchants are moving goods to and from distant lands, that in workshops craftsmen are creating objects of beauty and utility, that in temples priests are performing rituals that maintain the cosmic order. Your village is small, but it is part of something larger, part of a kingdom that, though you do not know it, stands at a crucial moment in human history. The capital, Sardis before gold. The city of Sardis sits on the southern slopes of Mount Tmolus, overlooking the broad valley of the Hermus River. To approach it for the first time is to feel the weight of established power, the accumulated presence of generations of rule. The road that leads from the valley floor climbs gradually, winding through olive groves and vineyards, past small farms where farmers pause in their work to watch travelers pass. As you ascend, the city slowly reveals itself, first as a distant cluster of buildings, then as individual structures begin to resolve, and finally as a complex urban landscape that dwarfs any village you have ever known. The outer districts of Sardis are modest, a sprawl of houses that seem to have accumulated organically over decades, following the contours of the hillside, connected by narrow streets that turn and branch without apparent plan. These are the homes of craftsmen and merchants, of laborers and servants, of the many thousands of ordinary people who make a great city function. The houses are built in the traditional style, walls of mud brick raised on foundations of stone, roofs of timber and thatch, small windows set high to keep out the heat of summer. In the early morning, smoke rises from countless hearths, and the air carries the smell of baking bread, of fires being stoked, of animals in small urban courtyards. As you continue to climb, the streets become wider, the houses larger and more substantial. Here live the wealthy merchants, the successful craftsmen, the minor nobles. Their homes are built around central courtyards, with rooms arranged for coolness in summer and warmth in winter, with walls that show the marks of skilled plastering, sometimes painted with simple geometric patterns or scenes of daily life. Through open gates you might glimpse these courtyards. See the olive tree that provides shade, the well that provides water, the loom where women work, the children playing under the supervision of a slave or elderly relative. And then, dominating everything, rising above the city, like a statement of power and permanence, is the Acropolis. This rocky outcrop, fortified by nature and improved by human hands, serves as both the religious heart of Sardis and the residence of its king. Stone walls follow the natural line of the cliffs, reinforced where necessary, pierced by gates that can be defended by a handful of men against an army. Within these walls stand the most important structures of the kingdom, the palace of the king, the great temple, the treasuries, where the wealth of the realm is stored, the barracks of the royal guard. The palace itself is a complex of buildings rather than a single structure, arranged around courtyards and connected by covered walkways. The architecture is heavy, built for permanence rather than elegance, with thick walls and small windows. The main hall, where the king receives petitioners and conducts the business of state, is supported by massive timber pillars, its walls decorated with woven hangings and captured weapons from past victories. The floor is packed earth covered with reed mats, and in the center burns a large hearth, for even in this relatively mild climate, the stone buildings can be cold in winter. At one end of the hall, raised on a platform of stone, sits the throne of the king, a chair of carved wood inlaid with ivory and gold, a seat that carries the accumulated authority of dynasty and tradition. The king, in these days before the coming of coinage, rules in a manner that is ancient and personal. He is not merely the chief administrator of an abstract state, but rather the father of his people, a figure who embodies in his person the unity and identity of the kingdom. He dispenses justice in person, hearing disputes brought before him, rendering decisions that are guided by custom and precedent, but also by his own wisdom and judgment. He leads the army in time of war. He performs the most important religious rituals, acting as the intermediary between his people and the divine powers that govern the world. His authority is not questioned, not because it is enforced by brutal repression, but because it is simply the way things are, the natural order of society as it has been understood for as long as anyone can remember. Yet the king's authority, while great, is not absolute. He rules with the advice of a council of nobles, men who command their own retainers, who control significant portions of the kingdom's wealth, whose support is necessary for any major undertaking. These nobles are not merely courtiers, but substantial powers in their own right, and a wise king knows to balance his will against their interests, to rule through persuasion and negotiation as much as through command. The court of Lydia is thus a place of constant political maneuvering, of alliances formed and dissolved, of favors granted and obligations incurred, of the subtle and not so subtle competitions for status and influence that characterize any concentration of power. Beyond the Acropolis, in the lower city, lie the markets of Sardis. This is where the economic life of the kingdom is most visible, where goods from across the known world accumulate and are redistributed. The market is not a single structure but a district, a complex of open squares and covered stalls, of narrow streets lined with workshops, of warehouses where merchants store their goods. Here you can find textiles from Phrygia, wine from the Greek islands, grain from the fertile river valleys, olive oil pressed in the hills, metalwork of extraordinary skill, pottery both plain and decorated, weapons, tools, jewelry, incense, spices from distant lands, slaves standing quietly under the eyes of dealers, donkeys and oxen and horses for sale, and everywhere the press of people, the noise of haggling, the calls of merchants advertising their wares. What you do not find, what does not yet exist, is the simple sight of coins changing hands. All trade is conducted by barter or by the exchange of precious metal measured by weight. A merchant who wishes to buy a bale of fine cloth must offer something in return, perhaps grain, perhaps oil, perhaps worked metal, perhaps raw silver or electrum. The relative values of these goods are established by custom and by negotiation, a process that requires time and skill and mutual trust. A buyer might offer a certain quantity of grain, the seller counter with a demand for more, and they will bargain back and forth until they reach an agreement that both find acceptable. This system has worked for centuries, but it is cumbersome and time-consuming, and it requires that both parties either want what the other has or can find a third party willing to engage in more complex exchanges. For transactions involving high value, lumps of precious metal serve as a medium of exchange. A wealthy merchant might carry with him a leather bag containing pieces of electrum, that natural alloy of gold and silver that is found in the rivers of Lydia. These pieces are irregular in shape, the result of breaking larger masses, and they vary in weight and purity. When such a piece is offered in trade, it must be weighed on bronze scales, and the parties must agree not only on the weight but on the purity of the metal, a matter that requires expertise and trust. A piece that is mostly gold is worth more than one that is mostly silver, but how much more? The determination requires judgment, knowledge, experience. It is an art as much as a science. The merchants who deal in these precious metals are figures of considerable status. They maintain workshops where they test metal, where they keep precise scales, where they store the wealth that flows through their hands. They are known for their honesty or not, and their reputation is their most valuable possession. A merchant known to cheat on weights or to misrepresent the purity of metal will find himself unable to conduct business. For in an economy based on trust, Trust once lost is nearly impossible to regain. These merchants are among the wealthiest commoners in the kingdom, and they move between the market and the palace, for the king himself requires their services, needs them to manage the flow of precious metal that comes from the rivers and mines, that arrives as tribute or trade, that must be stored in the royal treasuries. In the workshops that line the market streets, craftsmen practice their trades. You might pass a potter's workshop where men sit at wheels, shaping clay with practiced hands, while nearby kilns release wisps of smoke. You might see a weaver's shop where women work at large vertical looms, creating textiles in complex patterns, their fingers moving with astonishing speed through the warp and weft. You might hear the ring of hammer on anvil as smiths work bronze and iron, creating weapons and tools, jewelry and decorative objects. These craftsmen are specialists, people who have spent years learning their trade, often apprenticed as children to a master, gradually acquiring the skills and knowledge that define their profession. They take pride in their work, in the quality of their products, and the best among them have reputations that extend far beyond Sardis. The social life of Sardis is played out in these streets and markets, in the public spaces where people gather. There are taverns where men drink wine and discuss politics and trade. There are public fountains where women gather to draw water and exchange news and gossip. There are religious processions that wind through the streets on festival days, with priests in ceremonial robes, with musicians playing flutes and drums, with young people dancing, with offerings being carried to the temples. The city is alive with human activity, with the constant flow of people pursuing their various purposes, and if you spend any time here you begin to recognize faces, to understand the patterns of movement, to feel yourself part of this larger organism. Yet for all its bustle and vitality, Sardis before the age of coinage is in many ways a fragile place. Its wealth depends on the continued flow of gold from the rivers, on the maintenance of trade routes, on peace with its neighbors. The political system, for all its ancient roots, is dependent on the personal qualities of the king, on his wisdom or folly, his strength or weakness. The economic system, based on barter and trust, works smoothly enough in normal times, but can be disrupted by any number of factors: a failure of crops, a collapse in the value of some commodity, a war that closes trade routes, a loss of confidence in the purity of the metal that serves as a medium of exchange. And beneath the surface of daily life, barely visible to those who live within the system, pressures are building that will eventually demand some new solution. The kingdom is growing more complex, trade is expanding, the number of transactions is increasing, and the old methods, the patient negotiations, the careful weighing of metal, the complex chains of barter, are becoming inadequate to the demands being placed upon them. The merchants feel this most acutely, but even the king, even the priests in the temple, even the common farmer who brings his surplus to market, all are beginning to sense, however dimly, that something will have to change. But that change has not yet come. In this time, in this place, Sardis is still a city where value is negotiated person to person, where trust is built through repeated interactions, where wealth is something tangible and heavy that you can hold in your hand. It is a city of direct human relationships, of face-to-face commerce, of an economic life that has not yet been abstracted into the circulation of standardized tokens. It is a city standing unknowingly on the threshold of profound transformation, enjoying its last years of operating in a mode that stretches back to the very dawn of civilization itself. The Mermnad dynasty rises. The story of how the current royal house came to power is one that is told and retold in Sardis, a tale that mixes history and legend in proportions that no one can now untangle. The Heraclids, the ancient dynasty that had ruled Lydia for generations beyond counting, claiming descent from the hero Heracles himself, were overthrown in living memory. The circumstances of their fall and the rise of the Mermnads, the family that now sits upon the throne, form a narrative that speaks to the fundamental nature of power, of legitimacy, of the ways in which authority is claimed and maintained. The last of the Heraclid kings was named Candoles, a man who in the stories has become a figure of weakness and folly. The tale that is told begins with an obsession. King Candoles believed his wife to be the most beautiful woman in the world, and he spoke of her beauty constantly to his companions, to the point where it became a source of embarrassment. But words were not enough to satisfy his pride. He conceived a strange plan to prove his wife's beauty to his favorite bodyguard, a man named Gyges. He would have Gyges hide in the royal bedchamber and watch as the queen prepared for bed, so that he could see with his own eyes what the king so often described. Gyges protested, knowing that such a thing was deeply improper, that to see the queen unclothed would be a profound violation of honor and custom. But Candace insisted, and a king's command must be obeyed. And so one evening, Gyges concealed himself in the bedchamber, and when the queen entered and began to disrobe, he saw what he should never have seen. But as he attempted to slip away, the queen caught sight of him. She said nothing at the time, gave no sign of having noticed, but she understood what had happened, and she knew that her husband had arranged it. Her humiliation burned, but she was also a clever woman, and she began to plan. The next day, she summoned Gyges to her presence. She confronted him directly, telling him that she knew what had occurred, and she gave him a choice stark in its simplicity. Either he must die for the offense of seeing what he should not have seen, or he must kill the king who had commanded him to commit this offense, and take for himself both the throne and the queen. There was no third option. To refuse either choice would be to ensure his own death, for she would denounce him, and the king would have him executed. Gyges, trapped by forces he had not set in motion, chose to preserve his own life. With the queen's help, he hid once more in the royal bedchamber, and when Candace slept, he emerged and killed the king with the king's own dagger. This is the story as it is told, and like all such stories, it probably contains as much symbolism as fact. What is certain is that Gyges did indeed seize the throne, did overthrow the ancient Heraclid dynasty, did found a new line that took its name from his father Memnus. The legitimacy of his rule was contested. The old noble families were divided. Some supported the new king, seeing opportunity in the change. Others remained loyal to the memory of the Heraclids and plotted resistance. Gyges secured his position through a combination of political skill and ruthless action. He eliminated the most dangerous of his opponents. He rewarded those who supported him, and critically, he sought the approval of the gods. To the sacred oracle at Delphi, the most important religious site in the Greek world, Gyges sent rich gifts and sought a prophecy. Would his rule be blessed by the gods? The priestess of Apollo gave her answer in the ambiguous manner for which the oracle was famous. Yes, Gyges would be recognized as rightful king of Lydia, she declared, but there would be a price. In the 5th generation of his line, the dynasty would fall, and vengeance would come for the crime of overthrowing the Heraclids. This prophecy became famous, and in later years when it came true, it would be cited as proof of the gods' perfect knowledge and their inscrutable justice. But in the time of Gyges himself, the warning about the 5th generation seemed distant and abstract. The immediate answer was what mattered. The god had recognized his kingship, and with divine approval his legitimacy was established. Gyges proved to be a capable and ambitious king. He secured his eastern borders through warfare and diplomacy. He extended Lydian power westward, bringing several Greek cities of the Ionian coast under his control. He accumulated wealth and strengthened the kingdom's military forces. His reign lasted for 38 years, time enough to establish his dynasty firmly, to see his sons grow to manhood, to transform the memory of his violent seizure of power into the accepted foundation of a new ruling house. When he died, not in his bed but in battle against the Cimmerians, those fierce nomadic warriors from the north, his son Ardys succeeded him without serious challenge. The Memnad dynasty had become the legitimate royal house of Lydia. The political structure over which these kings ruled was complex, a layering of formal authority and customary obligation, of personal relationships and institutional roles. At the apex stood the king himself, whose word was law but whose power was most effective when it worked in harmony with the interests of the powerful nobles who formed his council. These nobles controlled estates, commanded men, collected revenues from their lands. They were not mere courtiers but regional powers, and their support or opposition could determine the success or failure of a king's policies. A strong king could dominate them, impose his will, demand their obedience. A weak king would find himself a prisoner of their competing interests, unable to act decisively, gradually losing authority until some ambitious noble might decide to try what Gyges had tried and seize the throne for himself. Below the nobles were the wealthy merchants and master craftsmen, people who had no inherited authority but whose economic importance gave them influence. These were the people who managed the complex flow of goods and precious metals, who possessed specialized knowledge, who could organize large-scale economic activities. The king needed them, and wise kings consulted with them, sought their advice on economic matters, granted them privileges and protections. In return, these merchants and craftsmen provided revenue through the trade they conducted, through the goods they produced, and through their willingness to extend credit and manage the logistics of large projects. The mass of the population, the farmers and laborers, the small craftsmen and servants, had no direct voice in government, but their contentment or discontent was always a factor in political calculations. A king who overtaxed, who failed to maintain order, who allowed famine or military disaster, would face not organized political opposition, for the common people had no mechanisms for such opposition, but rather a gradual erosion of legitimacy, a sense that the gods had withdrawn their favor, a mood that could in extreme circumstances lead to riot or revolt. The Lydian kings understood this instinctively. They presented themselves as fathers of their people. They provided public festivals and bread distributions. They settled disputes in a manner that was perceived as just. They maintained the temples and performed the necessary rituals. Political authority, in this age, was as much about maintaining cosmic order and social harmony as it was about commanding armies or collecting taxes. The king's daily life was both public and private, divided between the ceremonial duties that displayed his authority and the administrative work that maintained his power. He rose early, performed his morning prayers and ablutions, and then received his advisors. These daily audiences might deal with military matters, with reports from the borders where commanders kept watch against raids or invasion. They might involve economic issues, disputes between merchants, questions about the management of royal lands, decisions about the distribution of resources. They might concern judicial matters, appeals from nobles or commoners who felt they had been wronged and sought the king's justice. Through all these activities, the king was not merely making individual decisions, but also displaying his role as the living embodiment of the kingdom's unity and order. In the afternoon, the king might tour his capital, visiting workshops to inspect work being done for the palace, checking on construction projects, reviewing the royal guard. He might receive foreign ambassadors, listening to their messages, responding with carefully calculated courtesy or coldness depending on the state of relations with their masters. He might attend religious ceremonies at the temple, where his presence sanctified the ritual and his piety reassured his people that the gods continued to favor the kingdom. In the evening, he would dine, sometimes privately with his family, sometimes in the great hall with his nobles and honored guests, these dinners being as much political theater as social occasions, carefully orchestrated displays of hierarchy and favor. The position of king was powerful, but also burdensome, hedged with obligations and expectations. A king could not simply do as he pleased. He was bound by custom, by religious duty, by the need to maintain the support of those whose power he needed to rule effectively. He lived in luxury, but also in a kind of prison, always on display, always performing his role, never able to simply be an ordinary man. His children were raised to power, but also to danger, for succession was not automatic, and brothers might become rivals, and a king's son might spend his entire life waiting for his father to die so that he could finally rule. The court was a place of splendor, and also of intrigue, where fortunes could be made or lost on the king's favor, where reputations could be destroyed by a whisper, where one had to be constantly alert to the shifting currents of power and alliance. Yet for all its complexity and danger, there was also a certain magnificence to this system of rule. The king was not merely an administrator but a symbol, a living connection between heaven and earth, between past and future, between the gods and the people. When he appeared in procession, robed in his finest garments, wearing the crown that marked his office, flanked by his guards and attended by his courtiers, he embodied the kingdom itself. To see the king was to see Lydia personified, to feel in your chest the pride of belonging to a great and ancient realm. This symbolic power was as important as any military force, as any quantity of gold in the treasury. It bound the kingdom together, gave its people a shared identity, made them willing to fight and sacrifice and work not just for their own interests, but for something larger than themselves. And so the Mermnad dynasty, born in blood and legitimized by oracle, ruled over Lydia in these years before the coming of coinage. They were not philosophers or visionaries, but practical men concerned with power and glory, with extending their territory and increasing their wealth, with being remembered by future generations as great kings. They could not have imagined that their kingdom's greatest legacy would not be military conquest or political achievement, but an economic innovation, a simple stamped piece of metal that would change the world more profoundly than any war they could have fought. That innovation was coming, but in this time, in this moment, they ruled as their ancestors had ruled by the ancient methods, over an economy that had operated by the same principles for thousands of years. The stage was set, the actors were in place, but the drama had not yet reached its crucial scene. Wealth without coins, trade and barter. To understand what the invention of coinage truly meant, we must first understand the world that existed without it, the intricate and ancient system of exchange that had served human civilization for millennia. Picture yourself not as a powerful merchant or a wealthy noble, but as an ordinary person with something to trade, and follow through the process by which goods change hands in a world where money as we understand it does not exist. You are a farmer, and you have had a good harvest. Beyond what you need to feed your family through the winter, beyond what you must set aside as seed for next year's planting, you have surplus grain. This surplus is not simply a blessing, it is also a problem, for grain stored too long will spoil or attract vermin, and even if perfectly preserved it represents unused value, potential that exists only if you can exchange it for something else you need. And so you decide to take some of your surplus to market in Sardis. The journey takes 3 days. You load your grain into large ceramic jars, seal them carefully, and strap them onto your donkey. You bring your eldest son with you, for the road can be dangerous and there is safety in numbers. As you walk, you pass other travelers, some heading to the city as you are, others returning to their villages. You exchange greetings, share news, ask about conditions on the road ahead. At night you camp by the roadside, taking turns keeping watch, building a small fire for warmth and to keep animals away. The grain represents not just food but weeks of labor, months of careful tending, and you guard it carefully. When you reach Sardis and make your way to the market district, you are immediately engulfed in the noise and bustle of urban commerce. Merchants call out their wares. Animals bray and cluck and bleat. The air is thick with smells, the sweet scent of fresh bread, the acrid tang of dye vats, the musty odor of wool and leather, the sharp smell of fish brought from the coast. You find a spot in one of the open squares designated for grain sellers, unload your jars, and wait for buyers to approach. The first person to show interest is a baker, a stout man with flour dusting his forearms and a shrewd look in his eyes. He asks about your grain, tests a handful of it by biting a few kernels, examines it for signs of mold or pest damage. He nods approvingly. It is good grain, he says, and he is interested. But what do you want in exchange? This is the fundamental question of barter, the question that must be answered before any transaction can proceed. What do you need? What does he have? Can you reach an agreement that satisfies both? You tell him you need oil, olive oil for cooking and lighting, and you need wool, raw wool that your wife can spin and weave into cloth. The baker considers. He has some olive oil, he says, but not much, and no wool at all. He is a baker, not a farmer or shepherd. But perhaps, he suggests, he could offer you bread, fresh bread, that you could take back to your village, enough bread to feed your family for 2 weeks. You could then trade some of that bread for other things you need. This is the cascade of barter, the chains of exchange that must be constructed when direct trading of what you have for what you want is not possible. You shake your head. Bread will not keep for the 3-day journey home, and even if it did, you have grain, you can make your own bread. What you need is oil and wool, or something else you cannot produce yourself. The baker shrugs and moves on. Other potential buyers approach. Examine your grain, ask their questions. A tavern keeper offers wine, a sandal maker offers footwear, a potter offers jars. Each time the same calculation must be made. Is what they offer worth what you are asking? Will it solve your actual needs? Can you trust them to provide what they promise? Finally, a merchant who deals in textiles shows interest. He is a more substantial figure than the previous buyers, well dressed, with an assistant to carry his samples. He examines your grain with the air of a man who knows what he is looking at, and he makes you an offer. For all your grain, he will give you 3 large sacks of raw wool and a quantity of olive oil measured out in sealed jars. The wool, he assures you, is of high quality, sheared just this spring from healthy sheep. The oil is pressed from the first pressing, the finest grade. You negotiate, push for more. settle eventually on 4 sacks of wool and the same quantity of oil. The merchant agrees, hands are clasped, and the deal is made. But the transaction is not yet complete. The wool and oil must be measured and inspected. You go with the merchant to his warehouse, a large building near the market where his goods are stored. His assistant brings out the sacks of wool, and you examine them carefully, running your hands through the fibers, checking for dirt or debris, making sure the quality is as promised. The oil jars are opened. You taste the oil to verify its freshness and purity. Satisfied, you watch as your grain is measured into the merchant's containers, and then the wool and oil are loaded onto your donkey. The entire process has taken the better part of a day. This is barter at its most functional, a direct exchange of goods that both parties need. But what if you had wanted something that no one at the market possessed? What if you needed a specific tool, or a particular type of cloth, or some other specialized item? Then you would have to engage in more complex chains of exchange, trading your grain for something that could be traded for something else that could finally be traded for what you actually wanted. Or you would have to accept something valuable but not immediately useful, something you could store until you found someone who wanted it and had what you needed. For the wealthy, for the merchants who deal in high-value goods, barter is supplemented by the use of precious metals. These metals, primarily electrum in Lydia, but also gold and silver in their pure forms, serve as a kind of proto-money, a store of value that is universally accepted. A rich merchant who wishes to purchase a large quantity of dyed cloth might offer not grain or wine or some other commodity, but a lump of electrum weighed on precise scales. The seller of the cloth will accept this electrum because he knows that he can in turn use it to purchase whatever he needs, that anyone will accept precious metal in payment. But even this system has its complications. The lumps of metal are irregular, broken off from larger pieces, and they must be weighed carefully. The scales used for this purpose are sensitive instruments, bronze balances suspended from a beam, with weights of known value used to determine the mass of the metal being exchanged. A slight error in the scales or a deliberate attempt to cheat by using false weights can change the value of a transaction significantly. The merchants who specialize in dealing with precious metals maintain their scales with obsessive care, checking them regularly against standard weights, keeping them clean and level and properly calibrated. Even more complex is the question of purity. Electrum, the natural alloy found in Lydian rivers, varies in its composition. Some pieces contain more gold, others more silver. The difference is visible to an experienced eye, for gold is yellower and heavier while silver is whiter and lighter, but determining the exact proportion requires expertise. Merchants develop the ability to judge purity by color, by weight, by the way the metal responds to scratching with a hard stone. But there is always uncertainty, always room for dispute. Two merchants might look at the same lump of electrum and disagree about its value by 10 or 20%. This uncertainty is a source of constant friction in high-value transactions, a problem that costs time and creates distrust. Some merchants maintain testing facilities, small workshops where they can assess the purity of precious metals more accurately. They might heat the metal, for gold and silver have different melting points. They might use acid, for the two metals react differently to corrosive substances. They might file off a small sample and weigh it with extreme precision, calculating the ratio of gold to silver based on density. But all of these methods require time and expertise, and they cannot be done in the middle of a marketplace negotiation. They are for verifying large transactions, for assuring both parties that what is being exchanged is what both believe it to be. The system works, but it is inefficient. Every transaction requires negotiation, valuation, weighing, testing. Time that could be spent producing goods or moving them to market is instead consumed in the mechanics of exchange. Trust, which should be automatic, must be constantly established and verified. Opportunities for fraud exist at every step. A dishonest merchant can tamper with scales, can misrepresent the quality of goods, can pass off base metal mixed with precious, can promise delivery and then disappear. The institutions that later societies developed to manage these problems, written contracts, courts that enforce agreements, guilds that regulate trades and punish cheaters, exist in Lydia only in rudimentary forms. And yet, for all its cumbersomeness, the system has certain advantages that will be lost when coinage arrives. Every transaction is personal, conducted face to face, requiring human judgment and interaction. The value of goods is not abstract, but negotiated based on actual supply and demand, on the specific needs and resources of the parties involved. There is a certain honesty to it, a directness that will disappear when the mediation of standardized currency makes all things commensurable, reduces all values to a number, turns exchange into something mechanical and impersonal. The long-distance merchant, who travels not just to the market in Sardis, but along the great trade routes that connect Lydia to Egypt, to Babylon, to the Greek world, faces even greater challenges. He must carry with him goods valuable enough to make the journey profitable, but portable enough to be transported. Fine textiles, worked metal objects, jewelry, rare spices, precious stones, these are the commodities of long-distance trade, and because the journey may take months, because he will pass through the territories of many different kingdoms, each with its own customs and currencies, he must be able to exchange goods for local valuables, use those to purchase other goods further along, and eventually return home with a profit. These merchants develop networks of contacts, relationships built over years or even generations. In each major city along a trade route, a merchant will have an agent, someone who knows the local market, who can be trusted to store goods, who can help with negotiations and exchanges. These networks are held together by reputation and kinship, by the shared interest in maintaining the flow of trade, by the knowledge that everyone benefits from honesty and everyone suffers from disruption. A merchant who cheats his trading partners will find himself isolated, unable to conduct business, his networks collapsing around him. Trust is not merely a moral virtue, but an economic necessity. The roads along which these merchants travel are ancient, worn by centuries of trade. Some are paved, at least near major cities, but most are simply packed earth, dusty in summer, muddy in winter, always subject to the hazards of weather and banditry. The caravanserai, those fortified way-station stations where travelers can rest and merchants can store goods, are crucial infrastructure. The nodes in a network that connects the known world. In a caravanserai, you might meet merchants from a dozen different lands, speaking languages you do not understand, wearing strange clothes, worshipping gods you have never heard of, but all engaged in the same fundamental activity, the movement of goods from where they are abundant to where they are scarce, the transformation of that movement into personal profit. This is the economic world of pre-monetary Lydia, a world of direct exchange and precious metal weighed on scales, of trust built through personal relationships, of transactions that require time and skill and expertise. It is a world that has served humanity for thousands of years, that feels eternal and unchangeable to those who live within it. But it is also a world that is reaching the limits of its efficiency, that is beginning to creak under the weight of increasing complexity, that is ready, though those who live in it cannot know it, for a revolution that will change everything. The pieces are in place, the problems are apparent to those who deal with them daily, and somewhere in the workshops and treasuries of Sardis, the solution is beginning to take form. The sacred and the supernatural. To understand Lydia fully, to grasp what motivated its people and shaped their understanding of the world, we must turn from economics and politics to the realm of the sacred. Religion in this ancient kingdom is not a separate sphere of life, something distinct from the everyday, but rather the foundation upon which all else rests. The gods are real, their power tangible, their will expressed through signs and portents that must be read and obeyed. Every significant action, whether by a king or a common farmer, takes place within a framework of religious understanding, a sense that the human world exists within, and is dependent upon a larger cosmic order maintained by divine powers. Imagine entering a temple in Sardis in the cool hour, just after dawn. You have come to offer a sacrifice, to fulfill a vow you made when you prayed for your wife's recovery from illness. She has recovered, and now you must honor your promise to the gods. The temple is a substantial building, larger than any private house, its walls of stone and mud brick, its roof supported by columns carved from wood. As you step through the entrance, you move from the bright sunlight into a dimmer interior, your eyes adjusting slowly to the reduced light. The interior space is divided into chambers. The first is open to worshippers, a place where people gather for rituals and ceremonies. The walls are decorated with painted designs, geometric patterns and stylized representations of animals and divine symbols. The floor is of packed earth covered with woven mats. Along one wall stands a row of offering tables, stone surfaces stained with the residue of countless past sacrifices. The air is thick with the smell of incense, a resinous scent that catches in your throat, and beneath it the faint odor of blood and burned fat, the permanent perfume of sacrifice. Beyond this public chamber lies the inner sanctum, the place where the cult statue of the deity resides. You cannot enter there. That space is reserved for the priests, the consecrated servants of the god who tend the divine presence and perform the most sacred rituals. But through the doorway, in the dim light of oil lamps, you can glimpse the statue itself, a figure carved from wood and covered with gold leaf, its eyes made of precious stones that seem to gleam with their own light. This is not merely a representation of the god. In a sense that is difficult for a modern mind to grasp, this is the god, or at least the god's dwelling place, the physical location where divine power manifests in the human world. A priest approaches, an elderly man with a shaved head and a long white robe. You explain your purpose, and he nods.
You have brought with you a lamb,
Selected from your flock, a healthy animal without blemish, suitable for sacrifice. The priest inspects it, ensuring that it meets the requirements. He leads you to one of the offering tables, and other priests gather to assist with the ritual. One carries a bronze knife, its blade sharp and clean. Another prepares a fire in a brazier, where parts of the sacrifice will be burned. The lamb is positioned before the altar. You place your hand on its head, speaking the words of dedication, offering this life to the god in gratitude for your wife's recovery. The lamb stands quietly, unaware of what is about to happen. The priest with the knife steps forward, speaks a prayer in a ritual language whose words you do not fully understand, and then with a swift, practiced motion, he cuts the lamb's throat. Blood flows into a bronze bowl held by another priest. The lamb struggles for a moment and then goes still. Its life has passed from the mundane world to the sacred realm, carrying with it your gratitude and obligation. The priests work with efficient precision, practiced through countless repetitions. The lamb is butchered, its parts separated. Certain portions, the fat and some internal organs, are placed on the brazier where they will be burned, the smoke rising to carry their essence to the divine realm. Other parts, the meat, will be distributed according to custom, some going to the priests as their due, some to be shared in a communal meal, some to be taken home by the worshipper who provided the sacrifice. Nothing is wasted. The sacrifice is both a religious act and an economic transaction, a giving that creates obligation and relationship, a transfer of value from the material to the spiritual realm and back again. As the smoke rises and the smell of burning flesh fills the temple, the priest speaks words of blessing and confirmation. Your offering has been accepted. The god is pleased. The relationship between you and the divine has been properly maintained. You feel a sense of relief, of completion, of having fulfilled your duty. This is not merely superstition or empty ritual. For you, for everyone in this society, the reality of the gods is as certain as the reality of the mountain or the river. To neglect them would be not just foolish but impossible, like trying to ignore the weather or the seasons. The Lydian pantheon is complex, a mixture of native deities and gods adopted or adapted from neighboring cultures. There are gods of the sky and earth, of rivers and mountains, of fertility and warfare, of crafts and commerce. Some are worshipped only in specific locations, their power tied to particular temples or sacred sites. Others are universal, recognized throughout the kingdom. The Greeks, who have such extensive contact with Lydia, will later identify many Lydian gods with their own deities, seeing in Lydian religion variations of their own familiar divine figures. But for the Lydians themselves, their gods are distinctly their own, powers that have watched over their land and people since time immemorial. One of the most important sites of worship is the great temple on the Acropolis of Sardis, a structure that has stood for generations, rebuilt and enlarged over the centuries, but always on the same sacred ground. This temple is dedicated to the primary goddess of the kingdom, a deity associated with fertility, sovereignty, and the protection of the city. The king himself performs certain rituals here, for his authority is not merely political but also religious. He is the chief priest of the kingdom, the intermediary between his people and the gods, the person whose proper performance of ritual maintains cosmic order and ensures the prosperity of the realm. The priesthood forms a distinct class within Lydian society. Priests are drawn from certain families, their position often hereditary, passed from father to son or mother to daughter. They undergo training from youth, learning the proper forms of ritual, the calendar of festivals, the interpretation of omens, the medicinal and magical properties of plants and stones. They are literate, for sacred texts must be read and copied, and they are keepers of knowledge, maintaining libraries of clay tablets and papyrus scrolls that record myths, prayers, astronomical observations, and the accumulated wisdom of generations. The power of the priesthood is considerable but also limited by tradition and by the king's authority. Priests can influence public opinion, can declare omens favorable or unfavorable, can grant or withhold the blessing of the gods, but they cannot rule directly, cannot command armies or levy taxes. Their power is spiritual, exercised through ritual and interpretation, through their role as specialists in the sacred, mediators between the visible and invisible worlds. A wise king respects the priesthood, consults them on important matters, ensures that they are well supported and that the temples are maintained. A foolish king who alienates the priests may find that omens consistently run against him, that the gods seem to have withdrawn their favor, and such divine disfavor can be fatal to political authority. Oracles hold a particularly important place in Lydian religious life. These are sites where the gods speak directly to humans, usually through a priestess who enters a trance state and utters prophecies. The most famous oracle in the entire Greek world is at Delphi, and the Lydian kings regularly consult it on matters of great importance. But there are oracles within Lydia itself, smaller and less renowned, but no less real to those who seek their guidance. To consult an oracle is not a casual matter. It requires proper ritual, substantial offerings, and the framing of one's question in the correct manner. The answers provided are often ambiguous, requiring interpretation, but they are taken with profound seriousness. The most famous case of Lydian consultation with the Delphic oracle involves King Croesus, who ruled later than the period we are primarily considering, but whose story illustrates the relationship between royal power and divine knowledge. Croesus wished to know whether he should launch a war against the Persian Empire. The oracle told him that if he crossed a certain river, a great empire would fall, taking this as a favorable omen. Croesus launched his war. A great empire did indeed fall, but it was his own, not his enemies'. The story, whether entirely true or partly legendary, makes a point about the nature of divine communication. The gods speak truth, but humans must be careful in how they interpret that truth. Religious festivals mark the passage of the year, providing rhythm and meaning to the cycle of seasons. There are spring festivals celebrating planting and fertility, summer festivals thanking the gods for good weather, autumn festivals celebrating harvest, winter festivals focused on death and renewal. These are not merely religious observances but also social occasions, times when communities gather, when normal work ceases, when there is feasting and music and dance. The festivals reinforce social bonds, provide relief from labor, and remind people of their place within a larger cosmic and social order. During a major festival, the entire city of Sardis might be transformed. Processions wind through the streets, with priests in ceremonial robes, with musicians playing flutes and lyres and drums, with young people dressed in white carrying offerings. Animals are sacrificed in great numbers, and the smell of roasting meat fills the air. Wine flows freely, and there is a sense of license, a temporary relaxation of normal social constraints. In this sacred time, the boundary between human and divine, between earth and heaven, becomes permeable, and the gods are understood to be present among their people in a particularly direct way. The connection between religion and daily life extends into the home. Every household maintains a shrine to the family's protective deities, a small altar where daily offerings are made, where prayers are spoken at meals, where oaths are sworn. Children are raised with an acute sense of the sacred, learning from earliest childhood to respect the gods, to recognize omens, to perform the small rituals that maintain harmony with the divine order. This religious sensibility is not something separate from practical life, but woven through it, giving meaning and context to every action. Magic, which later ages will distinguish from religion, is in this time simply another aspect of the sacred. The power to heal with herbs and incantations, to protect fields from blight through proper ritual, to curse one's enemies through sympathetic magic. These are practical applications of the same forces that the gods embody on a grander scale. There are specialists in such matters, wise women and men who know the proper spells and procedures, who can be consulted when illness strikes or misfortune falls. Their power is real within the framework of belief that structures this society, and their services are sought by people at all levels, from wealthy nobles to humble farmers. Dreams, too, are understood as messages from the divine realm. A vivid dream, especially a recurring one, is not dismissed as mere fantasy, but examined for meaning. Dream interpreters are consulted to decode the symbolic language through which the gods communicate during sleep. A dream of water might portend change. A dream of fire might warn of danger. A dream of a deceased ancestor might indicate that proper funerary rites have been neglected. The interpretation requires expertise, for dream language is subtle and layered with multiple meanings. The dead themselves occupy a unique position in Lydian religious thought. They are not simply gone but continue to exist in a shadowy realm from which they can sometimes affect the living. Proper burial and ongoing funerary offerings are essential to keep the dead content and to prevent them from troubling their living descendants. Tombs are built with care, decorated with goods that the deceased might need in the afterlife, and visited regularly for memorial rituals. The great royal tumuli, enormous earthen mounds that cover elaborate burial chambers, are the most visible expression of this concern for the dead, but even humble graves receive attention and offerings. This entire system of belief and practice forms the invisible architecture within which Lydian life takes place. It is as real to those who live within it as any physical structure, as any political institution. The gods watch, the omens must be read, the rituals must be performed. To modern eyes, this may seem like a burden, a set of superstitions that constrain freedom and consume resources. But for the Lydians themselves, it is simply the way the world is, the necessary recognition of powers greater than human, the maintenance of relationships that make civilized life possible. And when the great economic transformation comes, when coinage is invented and begins to change society, it will not happen in isolation from this religious framework, but will itself be understood as a sacred innovation, blessed by the gods and marked with divine symbols. The stamped image on the first coins will not be merely decorative but will carry religious significance, will invoke divine power to guarantee value, will transform a simple piece of metal into something more than its physical substance. But that moment has not yet arrived. We remain in the time before, when value is negotiated rather than stamped, when exchange requires human judgment rather than mechanical counting, when the sacred and the economic, like all other aspects of life, are interwoven in ways that a more rationalized age will find difficult to understand or recover. The River of Gold, Pactolus. Of all the natural features that define Lydia, that make it a kingdom of legendary wealth, none is more important than the river Pactolus. This is not a great waterway like the Nile or the Euphrates, not a highway for commerce or a barrier to invasion, but rather a modest stream that flows down from the heights of Mount Tmolus, through the foothills where Sardis sits, and eventually joins the larger Hermus River in the valley below. What makes the Pactolus remarkable, what has given it a place in legend and myth that far exceeds its physical size, is the precious metal it carries in its waters. The phenomenon is natural, the result of geology and erosion operating over immense spans of time. Deep within Mount Tmolus lie veins of gold, ancient deposits formed when the mountain itself was thrust up from the earth's depths. Rain and snowmelt seep through cracks in the rock, dissolving minute quantities of gold, carrying it downward through underground channels. Where these waters emerge as springs, where they gather into streams that flow down the mountainside, they bring with them this dissolved gold. As the water moves over rocks and gravel, as it is exposed to air and sunlight, the gold precipitates out of solution, adhering to sand and small stones, accumulating in places where the current slows, creating deposits that can be collected by those who know where to look and how to extract them. The gold of the Pactolus is not pure. It occurs naturally alloyed with silver, in proportions that vary but average about 3 parts gold to 1 part silver. This natural alloy, called electrum, has a distinctive pale yellow color, paler than pure gold, with a slight greenish or silvery tint depending on the exact silver content. Electrum has been valued since ancient times, prized for its beauty and rarity, used for jewelry and decorative objects long before anyone thought to use it as a medium of exchange. Imagine now that you are a worker in the gold fields of the Pactolus, one of those men whose labor extracts this wealth from the river. Your work is both simple in concept and demanding in execution. You stand waist-deep in cold water, moving slowly along a section of the riverbed that has been assigned to you, using techniques that have been refined over generations, but remain fundamentally unchanged. In your hands you hold a shallow wooden pan, wider at the top than the bottom, with slightly sloping sides. You fill this pan with gravel from the riverbed, scooping up handfuls of stones and sand, and then you begin the process of washing. The technique depends on the simple fact that gold is much heavier than sand or stone. You swirl the pan in the water, using a circular motion that causes the lighter material to wash over the edge while the heavier material settles to the bottom. You add more water, swirl again, let more of the lighter material escape. It is a rhythmic motion, almost meditative in its repetition, requiring just the right speed and angle. Too vigorous, and you will lose the gold along with the sand. Too gentle, and the process takes forever. You learn by feel, by the slight resistance of the material in the pan, by the sound of it, by 1,000 tiny sensations that cannot be put into words but that your hands know perfectly well. Gradually, over the course of many repetitions, the lighter material washes away, and what remains in the bottom of your pan is a concentrate of heavy minerals, dark sand rich in iron, and mixed within it, if you are fortunate, small grains of electrum. These grains are tiny, most smaller than a grain of wheat, some no bigger than a poppy seed. They glimmer in the residue, catching the light with an unmistakable gleam. You carefully tip this concentrate into a leather bag that hangs at your waist, and then you begin again, scooping up another pan full of gravel, starting the washing process once more. The work is cold and wet and tedious. You stand in the river for hours, your legs growing numb from the chill water, your back aching from bending, your hands raw from the constant handling of wet sand and stone. In a good day you might collect enough electrum to fill a small cup. In a bad day, working a section of river that has already been heavily worked or where the gold content is naturally low, you might collect barely a thimbleful. The work is supervised, overseen by agents of the king, for the gold belongs to the royal treasury, and you are paid wages for your labor, modest compensation in grain and cloth, and occasionally in small pieces of the very metal you are collecting. There are other techniques as well, more elaborate methods for those sections of the river where the gold is more abundant. Sluice boxes are constructed, long wooden channels lined with fleece or woven mats. Water is diverted from the river to flow through these channels, carrying with it sand and fine gravel. The gold particles, being heavy, catch in the fleece or mats while the lighter material washes through. Periodically the sluices are cleaned out, the fleece is removed and washed in a separate pan to recover the accumulated gold. This method can process much more material than hand panning, but it requires infrastructure, the construction and maintenance of the sluices, the careful management of water flow, and so it is used only in the richest areas. The work continues through most of the year, stopping only when winter storms make the river too dangerous, when the water rises and turns turbulent, carrying away anything not firmly anchored. In summer, when the water is low and clear, the work is easiest, though the reduced flow means less gold is being transported from the mountains. Spring is often the best season, when melt water from the winter snows brings a fresh supply of gold down from the heights, depositing it in accessible locations along the riverbed. The workers in the gold fields are a distinct community, living in villages near the river, their entire lives organized around this peculiar form of labor. They develop specialized knowledge, learning to read the river, to recognize the places where gold is likely to accumulate, to judge by the color and texture of sand whether it is worth working a particular section. This knowledge is valuable, passed from father to son, sometimes guarded as a family secret. A good gold panner can earn more than a common laborer, and the best among them are sought after, treated with respect for their skill. The legend of King Midas is intimately connected with the Pactolus. The story tells that Midas, king of Phrygia, was granted a wish by the god Dionysus. Foolishly, Midas wished that everything he touched would turn to gold. At first this seemed wonderful, but he soon discovered the curse hidden within the blessing. Food turned to gold at his touch. Wine turned to gold. Even his beloved daughter turned to a golden statue when he embraced her. In desperation, Midas begged Dionysus to reverse the gift. The god took pity and instructed him to wash in the river Pactolus. When Midas did so, the golden touch was transferred from his body to the waters, and ever since the river has carried gold. The story is myth, of course, but it expresses a truth about the Pactolus, that it is a source of wealth but also a source of anxiety, that gold brings power but also brings problems. The river is sacred as well as economically important. There are shrines along its banks where offerings are made to the river god, prayers spoken for a good yield, thanks given when the gold flows abundantly. The mixing of the sacred and the economic, which might seem strange to a modern sensibility, is perfectly natural in this context. The gold comes from the earth, from the depths where divine powers reside, and it is appropriate to acknowledge those powers, to maintain proper relations with the forces that provide this wealth. The environmental impact of the gold workings is subtle but real. The constant disturbance of the riverbed, the diversion of water for sluicing, the accumulation of waste gravel and sand, all these gradually change the river's character. Areas that were once productive become exhausted, and the workers must move to new sections. The river, like any natural resource exploited by humans, is not infinite in its bounty, and there are already in this time concerns about declining yields, about the best locations being worked out, about whether the supply of gold can be maintained indefinitely. The gold itself, once collected, must be further processed before it can be used. The raw electrum, mixed with black sand and other impurities, is taken to workshops where it is cleaned and refined. The simplest method is to simply heat the mixture until the gold melts and the impurities can be skimmed off as slag. More sophisticated methods involve the use of acids or salts to separate the gold from other metals, techniques that are closely guarded secrets of the metal workers who practice them. The refined electrum is then formed into standardized lumps or ingots, weighed and marked, ready to be transferred to the royal treasury or to be used by merchants in trade. The treasury of the Lydian king is said to contain vast quantities of this metal, accumulating over generations. The surplus of production after the costs of collection and processing have been paid. This accumulated wealth gives the king his power, allows him to hire soldiers, to conduct diplomacy, to undertake building projects, to display the magnificence that maintains his prestige. The treasury is heavily guarded, located in the most secure part of the palace complex, accessible only to the most trusted officials. To see the storerooms where the gold is kept, to see the shelves lined with ingots, the chests filled with raw electrum, is to understand the material basis of royal power. Yet even as this wealth accumulates, even as the kingdom grows rich on the gold of its rivers, there is a growing sense among the merchants and administrators, who must deal with this metal daily, that the current system has limitations. The irregularity of the lumps, the variation in purity, the need to weigh and test every transaction, all these create inefficiencies and opportunities for dispute. The seeds of dissatisfaction are being sown, the felt need for some better way, some standardization that would make commerce flow more smoothly. The solution will come, though it has not yet been imagined in its final form. It will come from the very workshops where electrum is refined, where the properties of metal are best understood, where the technical expertise exists to solve technical problems. But for now, the river Pactolus continues to flow as it has flowed for millennia, carrying down from the mountains the gold that makes Lydia rich, the metal that will soon be transformed into something new, the raw material of a revolution that will change the world. Craftsmanship and art. If the river Pactolus provides the raw wealth of Lydia, it is the skilled hands of craftsmen that transform that wealth into objects of beauty and utility, that create the goods for which the kingdom becomes famous throughout the ancient world. To understand Lydian society before the age of coinage, we must spend time in the workshops where these craftsmen labor, must watch their techniques, must appreciate the level of skill that has been accumulated over generations and passed from master to apprentice in an unbroken chain reaching back into antiquity. Begin in a metalworking shop in one of the lower quarters of Sardis, a place where the ring of hammer on anvil is a constant sound from first light until darkness falls. The workshop is open to the street on one side, allowing passers-by to watch the work and the craftsmen to benefit from natural light and ventilation. The interior is dominated by a large clay furnace, its outer surface blackened by smoke, its interior glowing red when it is fired. Nearby are arranged the tools of the trade, hammers of various sizes, tongs for handling hot metal, files and chisels for detailed work, molds made of stone and clay, crucibles for melting, and the anvil itself, a mass of bronze fixed solidly to a large wooden block sunk deep into the earth. The master craftsman, a man in his middle years with powerful forearms and burn scars on his hands and arms, is working on a piece of jewelry, a gold bracelet commissioned by a wealthy merchant as a gift for his wife. He works the metal cold at this stage, having already shaped it roughly by heating and hammering. Now he is adding the fine details, using small punches and chisels to create a pattern of stylized animals and geometric designs. Each strike of the small hammer is precise, controlled, moving the metal exactly where he wants it to go, creating textures and depths that catch and reflect light. This is work that requires not just strength but delicacy, not just technical knowledge but aesthetic judgment. An apprentice tends the furnace, pumping a large leather bellows to force air into the coals, bringing them to the intense heat necessary to melt bronze or to soften gold for working. The apprentice is young, perhaps 12 years old, and he has been in this workshop for 3 years now, learning by observation and by performing the simplest tasks, gradually being entrusted with more complex work as his skills develop. He will spend years in this apprenticeship, and if he proves capable, he will one day be a master craftsman himself, perhaps even inherit this workshop when the current master grows too old to work. Metal working in Lydia has reached a high level of sophistication. Lydian smiths can work gold, silver, electrum, bronze, and increasingly iron, each metal requiring different techniques, different temperatures, different tools. They understand alloys, knowing how to combine metals to achieve desired properties, strength or flexibility, color or resistance to corrosion. They can cast complex shapes using both open molds and the more sophisticated lost wax technique, which allows the creation of detailed hollow forms. They can forge, joining pieces of metal by heating and hammering them together, creating seamless connections. They can inlay one metal into another, setting gold or silver into bronze, creating decorative effects of great beauty. The workshop produces a range of objects. There are purely utilitarian items, tools for farming or carpentry, weapons, cooking vessels, locks and keys. There are decorative objects, jewelry and ornamental fittings for furniture, statues for temples, elaborate vessels for ceremonies. The finest work requires months of labor, and the prices commanded reflect not just the value of the metal, but the skill and time invested in creation. A wealthy patron might commission a work years in advance, visiting periodically to check progress, offering suggestions about design, paying in installments as the work proceeds. Move now to a different kind of workshop, one where textiles are produced. Lydian textiles are famous throughout the ancient world, rivaling even the productions of Phoenicia and Egypt. The secret lies partly in the quality of the wool, from sheep raised in the uplands, where the grass gives the fleece particular properties, and partly in the dyes, especially the rich crimson and purple shades for which Lydia is renowned. The actual process of creating a fine textile is long and involves many different workers, each with specialized skills. The first step is the preparation of the wool. After shearing, the fleece must be cleaned, removing dirt and the natural oils, a process that requires repeated washing in water mixed with substances that help break down the grease. The clean wool is then combed, using large wooden combs with bronze teeth to align the fibers and remove any remaining debris. Only then can the spinning begin, the transformation of fluffy wool into strong thread. This work is done primarily by women, working alone or in small groups, using drop spindles, simple tools that are nonetheless capable of producing thread of remarkable consistency and strength. The spinning is done in homes, not in centralized workshops, and it occupies countless hours of female labor, the spindle dropping and rising, turning as it falls, the twist of the spinning hand feeding out new fiber, the work automatic and endless. The spun thread is collected by agents who travel from house to house, paying for the work and bringing the thread to the dyeing workshops. Here is where the particular magic of Lydian textiles is created. The dyeing process is complex and closely guarded. The most valuable color, the deep crimson that is the mark of wealth and status, comes from the crushed bodies of insects, specifically a type of scale insect that lives on certain plants. Tens of thousands of these insects must be collected, dried and ground to produce enough dye for a single garment. The resulting powder is mixed with water and mordants, substances that help the dye bond to the fiber, and the thread is immersed in this liquid, heated carefully to just the right temperature. Too hot and the wool is damaged, too cool and the dye does not take properly. The thread is left in the dye bath for hours or even days, with the exact timing depending on the depth of color desired. The dyed thread must then be rinsed repeatedly to remove excess dye and prevent bleeding, and then it is dried in the shade, for direct sunlight can cause the colors to fade. The smell of the dye works is distinctive, a mixture of the acrid odor of mordants and the earthy smell of the insect dye, and it marks these workshops from a distance. Workers in dye shops often have permanently stained hands, and the most experienced can judge the quality of a dye bath by color and smell, knowing by slight variations whether it will produce exactly the shade desired. The dyed thread is finally ready for weaving. The looms used in Lydia are vertical, large wooden frames set up in workshops or in the courtyards of large homes. The warp threads are stretched from top to bottom, held under tension by weights, and the weft threads are passed through them, over and under, in patterns that create both the structure and the design of the cloth. The weaver, usually a woman, though male weavers are not unknown, sits or stands before the loom, her hands moving with practiced speed, passing the shuttle back and forth, beating down each new row of weft to create a tight, even fabric. The complexity of the patterns that can be created is astonishing. Simple plain weaves alternate with areas of intricate geometric designs, stripes of different colors, textured bands created by variations in the weaving technique. The most elaborate pieces might take months to complete, and they are regarded as works of art, valued for the skill of their creation as much as for their material substance. A large decorated textile might serve as a wall hanging in a wealthy home, or as a ceremonial robe, or as a gift between kings, a demonstration of the giver's wealth and the recipient's worthiness. Pottery is another craft at which Lydians excel. Every household needs ceramic vessels for storage and cooking, and while much pottery is purely functional, there is also a tradition of decorated ware, pieces that serve everyday purposes, but are made beautiful through the skill of their creation. Walk into a potter's workshop, and you find a space dominated by the wheel, a horizontal disc that can be made to spin, allowing the potter to shape clay with extraordinary speed and precision. The potter sits beside the wheel, a lump of clay centered on its surface, and as the wheel spins, the clay rises under the pressure of the potter's hands, transforming from a shapeless mass into a vessel, a cup or bowl or jar, the walls even and smooth, the form elegant. But the spinning wheel shows only part of the skill. The clay itself must be properly prepared, mixed with exactly the right amount of water, kneaded to remove air bubbles, aged to develop the properties that make it easy to work. The vessels must be dried slowly to prevent cracking, and then they must be fired in a kiln, subjected to carefully controlled heat that transforms soft clay into hard ceramic. The temperatures required are substantial, and maintaining them requires expertise in managing the kiln, in judging when the firing is complete, in knowing how to cool the kiln slowly, so that the vessels do not crack from thermal shock. Decoration can be added at various stages. Designs might be incised into the soft clay before firing, or painted onto the surface using slips, liquid clays of different colors. Some Lydian pottery is decorated with painted scenes, human and animal figures, geometric patterns, the work requiring a steady hand and a good eye. The finished vessels are not just utilitarian objects but carriers of aesthetic value, things that please the eye and demonstrate the skill of their makers. Carpentry and woodworking are essential crafts, though wood being organic, less of this work survives for archaeology to examine. The carpenter's shop produces furniture for homes, structural timbers for buildings, carts and wagons, agricultural implements, musical instruments, and countless other objects. The tools are simple but effective: saws and chisels, drills and planes, all made of bronze or increasingly iron. The most skilled carpenters can join wood without metal fasteners, using precise cuts and peg joints that hold firmly yet can be disassembled if necessary. They understand the properties of different woods, knowing which are strong enough for structural work, which are flexible enough for cartwheels, which are beautiful enough for decorative furniture, which resist rot and insect damage for use in construction. There is a social hierarchy among craftsmen, with some trades carrying more prestige than others. Metal workers, especially those who work precious metals, are highly respected, their work requiring long training and bringing them into contact with wealthy patrons. Textile workers, despite the importance of their products, are less prestigious, perhaps because so much of the work, the spinning especially, is done by women in domestic settings, and is seen as an extension of household labor. Potters occupy a middle position, respected for their skill but not ranked with metal workers. Tanners and dyers, whose work involves unpleasant smells and substances, are necessary but socially marginalized, their workshops located on the edge of towns where the odors are less bothersome. Yet within each craft there is pride and a sense of identity. Craftsmen form informal associations, networks of mutual support and shared knowledge. They gather in certain taverns or parts of the market. They attend each other's workshops. They collaborate on large projects that require combined skills. A wealthy patron commissioning an elaborate piece of furniture might employ a carpenter for the structure, a metal worker for decorative fittings, an ivory carver for inlays, all working together under the coordination of a master craftsman who manages the project. The transmission of skill from generation to generation is formalized through the apprenticeship system. A boy, occasionally a girl in certain trades, enters a workshop as a child, often through arrangement between families, sometimes through payment from the child's parents to the master. The apprentice lives with the master's family, is fed and housed and clothed, and in return provides labor and gradually learns the trade. The early years are spent on menial tasks, cleaning the workshop, preparing materials, running errands. But always the apprentice is watching, absorbing technique through observation, and gradually the master begins to provide instruction, to allow the apprentice to try simpler tasks under supervision, to correct mistakes and explain principles. A good master teaches not just technique, but also the ethics of craft, the importance of honesty in materials and workmanship, the pride that should be taken in doing work well. The apprentice learns that a craftsman's reputation is built over years and can be destroyed by a single piece of shoddy work, that shortcuts might seem attractive but lead to failure, that mastery requires patience and attention to detail. These lessons are taught as much by example as by explicit instruction, absorbed through years of close association with someone who embodies the standards of the craft. When the apprenticeship is complete, usually after 7 to 10 years, the young craftsman faces a test, the creation of a masterwork, a piece that demonstrates full command of the craft's techniques and principles. If this piece is judged satisfactory by the master and by other established craftsmen, the apprentice becomes a journeyman, free to work for wages, to move between workshops, to begin accumulating the resources that might one day allow the establishment of an independent workshop. The journey from apprentice to master is long and difficult, and many never complete it, remaining journeymen their entire lives, skilled workers, but not independent masters. Those who do achieve mastery join a small elite, people whose skills are recognized and valued, who can command substantial payment for their work, who contribute not just labor but knowledge and innovation to their society. The arts of Lydia, these crafts practiced in workshops throughout the kingdom, represent an accumulation of knowledge built over centuries. Each generation learns from the previous and adds its own refinements, its own discoveries. The metal worker learns new alloys, the dyer discovers new mordants, the potter experiments with new glazes. This is not innovation in the modern sense, not rapid change driven by systematic research, but rather a slow organic development, tradition modified by experiment, knowledge deepening through practice. It is this accumulated skill, this deep understanding of materials and techniques, that makes Lydian products desirable throughout the ancient world, that gives the kingdom a source of wealth beyond even the gold of its rivers. And it is from among these craftsmen, specifically from the metal workers who best understand the properties of gold and electrum, that the solution to the problem of coinage will eventually come. Military power and expansion. A kingdom's wealth means little if it cannot defend itself, and the military power of Lydia in these years before coinage is substantial, a force that has extended the kingdom's borders and secured its trade routes. To understand this power, imagine yourself not as a farmer or craftsman, but as a soldier, one of the men who serve in the army of the Lydian king, who train for war, and who, when war comes, risk your life in battles whose outcomes will determine the fate of cities and kingdoms. You are a cavalryman, a member of that branch of the military for which Lydia is particularly famous. The Lydian cavalry is considered among the finest in the world, and with good reason. The kingdom's wealth allows it to maintain large numbers of horses, the steep costs of cavalry warfare, the breeding and feeding and training of war horses, the specialized equipment required, the long training necessary to create an effective mounted warrior. You come from a family of modest means, but sufficient resources to provide you with a horse and arms when you came of age, and you have served for 5 years now, long enough to be considered experienced, not yet old enough for the hardships of campaigning to have broken your body. Your horse is a compact, sturdy animal, not the massive destrier that will be bred in later centuries for European knights, but rather a mount bred for endurance and speed, capable of long marches and quick maneuvers. You have cared for this horse since it was given to you, have formed the bond that makes horse and rider function as a single unit in battle. You know its temperament, its strengths and weaknesses, the subtle signs that indicate fatigue or lameness or readiness to run. The horse knows your voice, your weight in the saddle, the pressure of your knees and the touch of the reins that communicate your will. Your equipment is substantial but not the full plate armor of later ages. You wear a bronze breastplate molded to fit your torso, protecting your vital organs while leaving your arms free for movement. On your head sits a bronze helmet with cheek plates that can be lowered to protect your face. Your shield is round, made of wood faced with bronze, carried on your left arm or slung across your back. Your primary weapon is a spear, 8 feet long, balanced for thrusting rather than throwing, though you carry a javelin as well for use at longer range. At your waist hangs a sword, a bronze blade about 2 feet long, the weapon of last resort when fighting becomes too close for the spear. The Lydian military is not a standing army in the modern sense. Most soldiers are men like yourself, who own land or practice a trade in peacetime, but who are called up for service when needed. You train regularly, gathering with your unit for drills and exercises, maintaining your skills, keeping yourself and your equipment ready. When the king decides to go to war, messengers are sent throughout the kingdom, orders are issued, and men begin to gather at designated assembly points. You leave your farm or workshop in the care of family, you pack your kit, you ride to the meeting place where your unit is forming. The organization of the army reflects the social structure of the kingdom. The cavalry, expensive to equip and maintain, is drawn primarily from the wealthy, from landowners and successful merchants, people who can afford horses and arms and who have the leisure to train. The infantry, requiring less expensive equipment, is drawn from a broader base, from farmers and craftsmen, from men who can afford basic arms, but not the costs of cavalry service. Within these broad divisions, there are further distinctions: elite units composed of nobles and their retainers, regular units of commoners, auxiliary troops drawn from subject peoples or hired as mercenaries. Command positions are held by nobles, men who have trained for leadership from youth, who understand tactics and strategy, who have authority over their troops by virtue of birth and proven ability. The Lydian military tradition values personal courage and leading from the front, and commanders are expected to be visible in battle, to inspire their men by example. This means that the casualty rate among the officer class is high, but it also means that the common soldiers trust their leaders, know that orders come from men who share the danger. Training emphasizes horsemanship and weapons handling, but also formations and coordinated movement. A cavalry charge is not simply a mob of individual riders but an organized mass, maintaining formation, striking at a chosen point with concentrated force. You have practiced this endlessly, riding in formation with your unit, learning to match your speed to that of the horses around you, learning to aim your spear while moving at a gallop, learning to wheel and reform after contact with the enemy. The discipline required is considerable, fighting against the instinct to simply charge ahead, maintaining awareness of your position relative to others, responding instantly to commands signaled by trumpet or flag. The actual experience of battle is something for which no amount of training can fully prepare you. The approach to battle begins hours before contact, as the two armies maneuver for position, each seeking some advantage of terrain or formation. You might spend half a day watching the enemy, waiting, feeling your nervousness build, trying to remain calm while your heart races and your mouth grows dry. The officers ride up and down the line, offering encouragement, checking equipment, ensuring that everyone is in position. When the order finally comes to advance, you move forward at a walk, maintaining formation, the entire cavalry wing moving as one. The enemy comes into clearer view, no longer a distant mass but individual men on horses, faces visible beneath helmets, weapons ready. The distance closes. The walk becomes a trot, the trot becomes a canter, and then at some final distance the trumpet sounds and you are galloping, the thunder of hundreds of hooves, the world reduced to motion and speed and the target ahead. The impact when the lines meet is chaotic and violent. Your spear strikes, or it misses. There is no time to think, only to react. Horses collide, men fall, weapons clash. The neat formation dissolves into a swirling melee where friend and enemy are mixed together. You strike at anyone who threatens you, try to keep track of your unit mates, look for the standard that marks your position. The noise is overwhelming, the shouts of men, the screams of wounded horses, the clang of metal on metal. Time becomes strange, seconds stretching into eternities, whole minutes passing in what seems like instants. If your side prevails, if the enemy breaks and flees, the pursuit begins, running down those who cannot escape, the killing continuing until exhaustion or discipline calls a halt. If your side breaks, then you flee, looking back over your shoulder, hoping your horse is faster than those pursuing, knowing that to fall is to die. And afterward, win or lose, there is the aftermath, the survey of casualties, the tending of wounded, the organization of camp, the mixture of elation, if you have survived, and horror at what you have done and seen. Not all military action is open battle. Much of warfare involves sieges, the reduction of fortified cities, a process that can take months or even years. You might find yourself camped outside the walls of a Greek city on the coast, watching the defenders, waiting for hunger or thirst to break their will. Siege warfare is tedious, long periods of inactivity punctuated by brief moments of intense violence when an assault is launched or when the defenders sortie out to disrupt the siege works. The conditions are often miserable, the army living in temporary camps subject to disease, poor food, boredom, the slow erosion of morale that comes from inaction. The infantry, while less prestigious than cavalry, is equally essential. These men fight on foot, armed with spears and shields, sometimes with javelins or bows. They form the solid mass that anchors the battle line, the wall of shields against which cavalry charges break, the force that holds ground while cavalry maneuvers. Infantry tactics in this era emphasize the shield wall, men standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, spears projecting forward, a formation that requires discipline and courage, for to break the formation is to invite disaster. Lydian armies also employ light troops, skirmishers who fight with missile weapons, javelins and bows and slings. These men are often drawn from the more rugged parts of the kingdom, mountain peoples whose traditional way of life includes hunting and who are skilled with missile weapons from childhood. They do not fight in formation but operate in loose groups, harassing the enemy, screening friendly forces, exploiting opportunities where they appear. Their casualties are often high, for they lack the protection of armor and formation, but their contribution to battle is significant. The logistical challenges of maintaining an army in the field are substantial. Men and horses must be fed, and the quantities required are enormous. An army of 10,000 men might consume several tons of grain per day, to say nothing of the fodder required for thousands of horses. This food must be brought from the kingdom's stores or taken from the surrounding country, and its acquisition and distribution requires organization and oversight. Blacksmiths must travel with the army to repair equipment, physicians to tend the wounded, priests to perform necessary rituals and maintain morale. The objectives of Lydian military campaigns vary. Some wars are defensive, responding to raids or invasions by enemies, pushing them back and securing borders. Others are aggressive, campaigns of conquest aimed at extending Lydian control over neighboring territories, bringing new lands and peoples under the king's authority. And some are punitive, expeditions designed to enforce obedience from vassal states or to punish those who have rebelled or refused tribute. The Greek cities of the Ionian coast are a particular focus of Lydian military attention. These cities, though culturally Greek, lie geographically within what the Lydian kings consider their natural sphere of influence. Over the decades preceding the period we are examining, Lydian armies have campaigned repeatedly against these cities, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The Greeks are formidable opponents, their hoplite infantry well-trained and disciplined, their cities strongly fortified. But Lydia's superior numbers and resources, its ability to sustain long campaigns, gradually tipped the balance. One by one, most of these cities come to acknowledge Lydian overlordship, though the relationship is often uneasy, punctuated by revolts and renewed campaigns. To the east, Lydia faces a different challenge, the Median Empire, a vast state centered in what is now western Iran. The Medes are powerful, their armies large and well organized, and the border between Lydia and Media has been contested for years, with raids and skirmishes and occasional larger battles. For a time the two powers are evenly matched, neither able to achieve a decisive advantage. Eventually, a kind of balance is reached, a recognition that neither can conquer the other without prohibitive cost, and this leads to a formal treaty and a settling of borders. But the peace is always fragile, always subject to the ambitions of new kings or the provocations of border incidents. Fortifications are a crucial part of military infrastructure. The cities of Lydia are protected by walls, some quite ancient, rebuilt and strengthened over generations. The Acropolis of Sardis, the heart of royal power, is particularly well defended, its natural cliffs augmented by constructed walls, its gates massive and heavily guarded. Other strategic points, mountain passes and river crossings, are protected by smaller forts, garrisons maintained year-round to watch for threats and to provide bases for military operations. The relationship between the military and civil society is complex. Soldiers are respected when they return victorious, celebrated for their service. But they are also feared, for men trained to violence can be dangerous even to their own people. Discipline is maintained through strict leadership and harsh punishments for those who break ranks or who plunder without authorization. The ideal is that soldiers serve the state, defend the kingdom, and then return to their civilian lives when the campaign ends. But the reality is often messier, with veterans forming bonds that persist after military service ends, with officers using their men's loyalty for political purposes, with the potential always present that an army might become a force unto itself, a threat to the very kingdom it is meant to protect. The military power of Lydia, built over generations, maintained through constant training and periodic campaigning, is one of the pillars on which the kingdom's prosperity rests. Trade routes must be defended, borders secured, rivals deterred or defeated, the cavalry thundering across a battlefield, the infantry standing firm behind their shields, the archers sending volleys into enemy ranks. All these are expressions of political will backed by economic resources. The king's gold pays for horses and arms, feeds soldiers on campaign, rewards success and punishes failure. Military power and economic power are inseparable, each reinforcing the other, creating the stability that allows civilization to flourish. And soon, when the innovation of coinage comes, the military will be one of the first sectors to benefit. For paying soldiers in standardized coins will be far more efficient than the current system of distributing grain and cloth and irregular pieces of precious metal. But that is still to come. For now the army operates as armies have always operated, bound by personal loyalty and sustained by the traditional mechanisms of a pre-monetary economy. The threshold of change. There comes a moment in the life of any society when pressures that have been building beneath the surface suddenly demand resolution, when problems that have been managed through traditional methods become too acute to ignore, when innovation becomes not merely desirable but necessary. For Lydia in the middle of the 7th century BCE, that moment is approaching. The kingdom stands on the threshold of a transformation that will change not just Lydia itself but the entire ancient world, a revolution in economic practice that will alter forever how human beings exchange goods and measure value. The problems are evident to anyone who deals regularly with commerce. The merchant who must weigh and test every lump of electrum, who spends hours negotiating the relative values of goods, who must maintain a complex network of trust relationships to conduct business across distances, feels the inefficiency of the system every day. The royal treasurer who must manage vast quantities of precious metal, who must verify the purity of every piece that enters the treasury, who must convert between different standards of weight used by different trading partners, understands that the current system cannot scale indefinitely. The metal worker who refines electrum and knows its properties better than anyone recognizes that the variation in purity creates unnecessary complications, that some form of standardization would benefit everyone. King Alyattes, who rules Lydia during this crucial period, is by all accounts a capable and far-sighted monarch. He has consolidated royal power, defeated external enemies, secured the kingdom's borders, and presided over an era of prosperity. But he is also attentive to practical matters, interested in the mechanics of administration, willing to consider innovations that might improve efficiency. He knows that the merchants who bring wealth to his kingdom are hampered by the cumbersome nature of trade as currently conducted. He knows that his own administrative apparatus, the collection and distribution of revenues, the payment of soldiers and officials, would all be more efficient with some better system. In the royal workshops where precious metals are refined and stored, experiments have been ongoing for years. The metal workers have long understood that electrum, while naturally occurring, could also be artificially created by mixing gold and silver in controlled proportions. They have developed techniques for assaying metal, for determining with reasonable accuracy the ratio of gold to silver in any piece. They have experimented with creating standardized ingots, pieces of metal cast to specific weights, marked with symbols indicating their content. These experiments are not driven by a vision of coinage as such, for that concept does not yet exist, but rather by the practical desire to make the handling of precious metal easier and more reliable. The breakthrough, when it comes, is not a single eureka moment, but rather a gradual realization that several existing practices could be combined in a new way. The metalworkers already make standardized pieces of electrum. The royal treasury already marks these pieces with symbols to indicate their origin and purity. The administrative apparatus already has systems for weighing and valuing metal. What has not been done is to create pieces so standardized, so reliable, that they do not need to be weighed and tested for each transaction. Pieces whose value is guaranteed by the authority of the king himself. Pieces that can circulate as units of exchange rather than as raw metal valued only by weight. The technical challenges are significant, but not insurmountable. To create truly standardized pieces, several requirements must be met. First, the purity of the electrum must be consistent. The metal workers develop methods for achieving this, carefully mixing gold and silver in controlled proportions, testing the result, adjusting until the desired composition is achieved. Second, the weight of each piece must be consistent. This requires precise scales and careful work, but it is within the capability of skilled craftsmen. Third, the pieces must be marked in a way that indicates their value and authenticity, that prevents counterfeiting or alteration. This is achieved through stamping, using engraved dies to impress images into the metal. The first pieces that emerge from these experiments are small, irregular in shape, bearing simple marks, images of a lion's head or a simple geometric pattern. They are not yet true coins in the sense that will develop later, not perfectly round, not bearing elaborate designs or inscriptions. But they represent something fundamentally new. They are pieces of metal whose value is determined not by weighing and testing, but by the mark they bear, pieces that carry the implicit guarantee of the royal authority that created them. They are abstraction made concrete, value divorced from the physical substance that carries it, money in a form that will prove revolutionary. The initial use of these pieces is limited, experimental. They are distributed to merchants who deal with the royal treasury, used for large transactions, where their convenience is most apparent. The advantages become immediately clear. A merchant who previously had to carry scales and weights, who had to negotiate the purity of every piece of metal, who had to spend time testing and verifying, can now simply count these standardized pieces. The value is known, guaranteed by the king's mark, accepted without question because everyone trusts that the royal authority would not debase its own currency. Transactions that once took hours can now be completed in minutes. But with this convenience comes a fundamental change in the nature of economic relationships. When value was negotiated, when every transaction required human judgment, when trust was personal and direct, economic activity was embedded in social relationships. The merchant knew his trading partners, had built relationships over time, relied on reputation and face-to-face interaction. The introduction of standardized currency begins to change this. Transactions become more impersonal, more mechanical. The standardized piece mediates between buyer and seller, reduces their relationship to a simple exchange of commodity for token. This is more efficient, but it is also more abstract, less human. There is resistance, as there always is to significant change. Some merchants, particularly older ones comfortable with traditional methods, distrust the new pieces. They continue to prefer dealing in weighed metal, arguing that the standardized pieces might be debased, that royal authority might prove unreliable, that the traditional methods, while cumbersome, have the advantage of transparency. Some religious authorities raise concerns, questioning whether it is proper to mark precious metal with symbols, whether this might somehow dishonor the gods from whom, ultimately, all wealth derives. Some common people, those who deal primarily in barter and who have little access to precious metal in any form, see the new system as irrelevant to their lives, a concern of the wealthy that does not touch them. But the advantages are too great for resistance to prevail. The standardized pieces spread, first within Lydia, then to neighboring regions. Other kingdoms, seeing the benefits, begin to produce their own versions. The concept of coinage, born in Lydia, begins its conquest of the ancient world. Within a generation, coins will be minted by cities and kingdoms throughout the Greek world. in Persia, eventually in Rome. The revolution that begins in the workshops of Sardis will spread across continents and down through centuries, transforming economic life in ways that the first creators of coins could never have imagined. Consider what is being created here. A coin is more than a piece of metal. It is a symbol, a token that represents value but is not itself the source of that value. The gold or silver or electrum from which a coin is made has value, but the coin's value as money depends on acceptance, on the collective agreement that this marked piece is worth what it claims to be worth. This acceptance is initially guaranteed by royal authority, by the king's power to punish those who counterfeit or refuse to accept his currency. But over time, the coin's value becomes more abstract, depending on confidence in the issuing authority, on the stability of the economic system, on factors far removed from the physical substance of the metal itself. This abstraction is both powerful and dangerous. It allows for the creation of credit, for promises of future payment, for the accumulation of wealth in forms that can be easily transported and stored. But it also creates the possibility of monetary manipulation, of inflation and deflation, of economic crises that result not from real shortages, but from disturbances in the abstract system of valuation. The coin, innocent piece of stamped metal, opens doorways to both prosperity and disaster, to economic possibilities that earlier ages could not have conceived. The social implications are equally profound. In a barter economy, wealth is concrete, visible, stored in the form of land, livestock, goods. A wealthy person is one who visibly possesses much. But once wealth can be stored in the form of coins, once it becomes abstract and portable, the social markers of wealth begin to change. A person might be enormously wealthy, yet live simply, their fortunes stored in chests of coins, rather than displayed in herds and granaries. Conversely, a person might appear prosperous through spending while actually being in debt, having borrowed coins that must eventually be repaid. The coin enables new forms of social mobility and new forms of inequality, new possibilities for accumulation and for loss. For Lydia itself, the invention of coinage comes too late to save the kingdom from its eventual fate. Within a generation of these first experiments, the Persian Empire will rise under Cyrus the Great, and Lydia will fall before Persian armies. The last Lydian king, Croesus, legendary for his wealth, will see his kingdom conquered and absorbed into a larger imperial structure. But the invention that began in Lydia will outlive the kingdom that created it. Long after Sardis has become just another provincial city in someone else's empire, long after the Mermnad dynasty has been forgotten, except by historians, coins will continue to circulate, spreading the Lydian innovation throughout the ancient world and beyond. The irony is that this invention, created to solve practical problems of commerce, will eventually contribute to the erosion of the social world that created it. The personal, face-to-face, relationship-based economy of traditional society will gradually give way to a more impersonal, abstract, market-based system where everything has a price, and where price is determined by the mechanical interaction of supply and demand rather than by human negotiation. The coin, instrument of efficiency, is also an instrument of alienation, transforming human relationships into monetary transactions, reducing complex social bonds to simple exchanges of value. But in this moment, on this threshold, before the full implications have become clear, there is only the practical innovation, the standardized piece of electrum bearing the mark of the Lydian king. The metal workers who create these pieces, the officials who distribute them, the merchants who begin to use them, none of them can foresee what they have set in motion. They are solving immediate problems, making their work easier, improving the efficiency of commerce. They cannot know that they are participating in one of history's great revolutions, that the simple stamped disc they are creating will change the world more profoundly than any military conquest, any philosophical insight, any artistic achievement of their age. Legacy and reflection. And so we come to the end of our journey through the kingdom of Lydia in those years before the first coins of gold. We have walked through the streets of Sardis, stood in the workshops of craftsmen, watched the river Pactolus flow with its cargo of precious metal. We have observed the intricate dance of barter and exchange, the weighing and testing of electrum, the slow accumulation of wealth through trade and tribute. We have seen a society that was sophisticated and complex, that had developed elaborate systems for managing economic activity, yet that lacked the one innovation that seems so simple in retrospect, the standardized coin. What was lost when coinage arrived? This is a question worth contemplating as we prepare to leave this ancient world and return to our own. The pre-monetary economy of Lydia was inefficient, certainly, cumbersome and time-consuming, but it was also deeply human. Every transaction required human interaction, required people to look at each other, to speak, to negotiate, to build the trust that made exchange possible. The value of goods was not fixed but negotiable, determined by the specific circumstances of each transaction, by the needs and resources of the particular individuals involved. This meant that commerce was embedded in social relationships, that economic activity could not be separated from the broader fabric of human connection. The merchant who traded regularly with the same partners was not merely engaging in economic transactions but maintaining relationships, building networks of obligation and reciprocity that extended beyond the purely economic. The craftsman who created an object for a specific patron was not just selling a product but participating in a social interaction, demonstrating skill, earning respect, creating something that would be valued not just for its utility but for the human care that went into its making. The farmer who brought surplus to market was not just converting goods into other goods but participating in the life of the community, meeting people, exchanging news, maintaining connections. When the coin arrived, when value could be abstracted and standardized, when transactions could be reduced to the simple exchange of commodity for currency, something was lost. Commerce became more efficient but also more impersonal. The social dimension of economic activity began to separate from the purely transactional. Markets that had been places of human interaction began their long transformation into mechanical systems for matching supply with demand. This was progress, certainly, in terms of efficiency and economic growth, but it was also loss, a diminishment of the human element in economic life. The physical evidence of Lydian civilization, what archaeology has recovered and what still awaits discovery, tells only part of the story. We have the ruins of Sardis, walls and foundations, the remains of temples and palaces. We have some pottery, some metalwork, a few inscriptions in that lost Lydian language. We have the tumuli, those enormous burial mounds that dot the landscape, testifying to the wealth and power of Lydian kings. We have most famously the coins themselves, those first standardized pieces of electrum, preserved in museums, studied by scholars, tangible links to the innovation that began in these river valleys. But the lived experience of Lydian civilization, the texture of daily life, the thoughts and feelings of the people who inhabited this world, these are largely lost to us. We can reconstruct the outlines, can make educated guesses based on what we know of other ancient societies, but the specific details, the individual voices, the particular stories, these have faded into silence. The farmer whose day we imagined, the merchant in the market, the metal worker at his forge, the soldier on campaign, all these are composite figures, constructed from fragments of evidence and reasonable inference, but not actual historical individuals whose names we know and whose lives we can fully document. This is the nature of deep history, the study of times so distant that much of what we would like to know is simply unrecoverable. We work with what survives, physical remains and occasional texts, and from these fragments we try to reconstruct whole civilizations. The picture we create is necessarily incomplete, full of gaps and uncertainties, more educated guessing than certain knowledge. Yet even incomplete understanding is valuable. Even a partial picture of how people lived in a time and place so different from our own can illuminate aspects of human experience that transcend particular cultures, can show us both how different people can be from each other and also how much we have in common across vast gulfs of time and culture. The kingdom of Lydia, for all its wealth and innovation, was ultimately swept away by larger historical forces. The Persian Empire, which conquered Lydia in the mid-6th century BCE, was itself eventually conquered by Alexander the Great, and his empire fragmented after his death. The region that had been Lydia passed through the hands of various Hellenistic kingdoms before eventually becoming part of the Roman Empire. Through all these political transformations, the city of Sardis continued to exist, though its role changed, becoming a provincial center rather than a capital, its ancient glory fading into local memory and legend. The Lydian language died out, replaced first by Greek and later by other languages, until no one remained who could speak it or read its script. The Lydian gods were forgotten or syncretized with Greek deities, their temples falling into ruins or being converted to other uses. The specific cultural identity of Lydia, what it meant to be Lydian rather than Greek or Persian, or any other identity, dissolved into the larger cultural currents of the ancient world. What survived was not the kingdom itself, but the innovation it had contributed, the standardized coin, which spread far beyond its point of origin and became one of the fundamental tools of human civilization. In our own time, we live in a world so thoroughly monetized that it is difficult to imagine life without money. Every transaction, every exchange of goods or services, operates through the medium of currency. We earn money through labor, spend it on what we need and want, save it for the future, invest it in hopes of increase. The entire global economy, with all its complexity, its financial markets and credit systems, and electronic transfers, ultimately traces back to that simple innovation in a Lydian workshop, the stamped piece of metal, whose value was guaranteed by authority rather than determined by weight and purity. Yet perhaps we should remember, as we conclude this journey, that the world existed and functioned for thousands of years before that innovation, that civilizations rose and prospered, that human beings traded and built and created, all without the benefit of coinage. The efficiency that money brings has enabled enormous economic growth, has made possible the complex, interconnected world we inhabit. But it has also brought its own problems, its own forms of inequality and alienation, its own crises and disruptions. The pre-monetary world was not paradise, was not free of problems or hardships, but it was perhaps more human in scale, more comprehensible, more directly connected to the actual needs and labors of real people. As you drift towards sleep, as this story of an ancient kingdom fades from your conscious awareness and becomes part of the landscape of dreams, perhaps you might carry with you this image, a river flowing down from mountains, carrying in its waters tiny grains of gold, and on its banks, people working, sifting, separating, accumulating this precious substance, not yet understanding that they possess the raw material of a revolution, not yet imagining that from their labor will come an innovation that will change human civilization forever. They are simply doing their work, living their lives, participating in an economy that has existed in essentially the same form for millennia, unaware that they stand at a threshold, that change is coming, that the world is about to transform in ways they cannot foresee. This is always the human condition, to live in the present while standing on the threshold of an unknown future, to participate in processes whose full implications only become clear in retrospect, to create innovations whose ultimate effects we cannot predict. The Lydians who first stamped metal into standardized forms were not trying to change the world. They were trying to solve practical problems, to make their work more efficient, to serve their king and advance their careers. Yet in doing so, they unleashed forces that would reshape human society in fundamental ways. And so our story ends, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a gentle fading, a return from that ancient world to your own time and place. The kingdom of Lydia is gone, vanished into the depths of history, but something of it remains, preserved in museums, recorded in books, and most profoundly, embedded in the economic systems that structure our own world. Every coin in your pocket, every number in your bank account, every electronic transfer of funds, all these are distant descendants of that first Lydian innovation, echoes of a revolution that began in river valleys of western Anatolia more than 26 centuries ago. Rest now, let the story fade. Let yourself drift into sleep with images of ancient cities and sacred rivers, of craftsmen at their work and merchants in their markets, of a world both strange and familiar, both impossibly distant and somehow still present in the structures of our own civilization. Dream of Lydia, of a kingdom built on gold, of a people who lived and worked and loved and died in times we can barely imagine, yet whose legacy touches every aspect of our modern world. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time, for spending these hours in contemplation of an ancient kingdom and its people. Our voyage through the past comes to an end, but the questions it raises, the insights it offers, the connections it reveals between past and present, these remain with you to contemplate in your own time. Until we meet again in another story from the archive of history, rest well, sleep deeply, and dream of ages long vanished but never entirely forgotten. Good night.